Welcome to Tiki Technical Tuesday. In the past, we have slipcast large molds like this. In fact, we've done quite a few episodes on that. So this week, we are going to do something very small, and we're going to do it in porcelain. In fact, we're going to cast 5 castings today. I normally do 10 when I'm doing these pendants, but since we're at the very end of the edition, I've already cast the entire edition, I'm going to do 5 extras as an emergency safety backup in case I drop something cracks during firing. You never know. Porcelain, it's a tricky fish, and you never know what it's going to do when it's in the kiln. Now, before I get into pouring porcelain into these, we should probably talk about what these molds are made of. Let's just talk about what we're going to be casting. We are going to make a ceremonial adze, a cutting tool that was used throughout Polynesia, in fact, throughout many ancient cultures. In fact, it's even used today. Now, this is a ceremonial one. It is very delicately carved, and it would be worn as a pendant by perhaps a master carver or somebody important. Who knows? It's an ancient relic. We don't really know its true history. I sculpted this adze in Monster Clay Firm. It's a wax-based modeling clay. And here you can see I did a quick time-lapse of the sculpting process. I did an armature out of acrylic over which I built up layers of the clay. I tried to snap a photo every 5 minutes when I remember to do it. And you can see I used a lot of paper templates and very tiny sculpting tools to wind up with this finished master model. All right, we've got a finished sculpture, and that means it's time to make a mold. We're going to do a 3-piece mold to cast these pendants. It's going to be kind of the traditional 1 and 2 pieces that you might know of and envision in your head, and that's going to be 1 big piece for the face, 1 big piece for the back, but then we're going to do an extra bonus piece, which I'm going to call the nubbin. And if you're wondering what the nubbin's going to do, don't worry, I will describe that later. Just know that it exists, and you're going to see me putting it in. Let me just see, we're finishing up the edges. This is the tricky part. And then here comes the nubbin. All right, there it is. It's that shape that you can see at what will be the top of the pendant. What's it going to do? Well, I'll give you a hint. This is not a tiki mug that we're making. It is a pendant. It's going to be a closed form. We don't want any openings in this, except for, well, the opening that the thread is going to go through there. All right, so we got the nubbin in place. We've got everything ready to go, so we're just going to put a foam core box around this and fill it up with plaster. I'm using a vibrating table here, so don't worry. Your eyes do not deceive you. This is shaking. The whole table is vibrating to get rid of air bubbles as we fill up this mold to make sure that we don't trap any air bubbles on the critical surface of the sculpture. All right, once the plaster is set, it's time for me to pull away all that foam core and move on to the next piece. If you're wondering why I picked the face as the first piece, it's because it's the most important part of the sculpture. It's the part that I wouldn't want to accidentally bump the tool or mess up or damage in any way. So this way I know it's safely encased in that first mold piece, and I can move on to part 2. Part 2 is the back of the pendant, and you can see the nubbin is still there. I'm leaving that nubbin piece in place, and what I'm going to do after we cast this second piece of the mold, I will pull that little plug of clay out, and that will be part 3 of the mold. So we're once again building up foam core walls. I put these little spacers around the foam core to support the walls so that the pressure of the plaster doesn't push them out, and we fill it up once again on the vibrating table. And last but not least, the nubbin. I pull the clay out of there and then fill that void with plaster to make our third and final part. Now it is time to try to open this master mold. I'm not going to lie, this is one of the most stressful parts of mold making for me. We've put tons of time into this sculpture. Oh, wait. Oh my gosh. This opened way easier than I expected. I think it's in part to the mold release that I've switched to. It's called like Ultra Lube or something like that. I will put notes. I'll put the link in the notes. But the plaster didn't lock up at all. It came apart nicely. And then as an added bonus, well, there's the nubbin. That's the nubbin. Yeah, that's genuine relief. This is a one-take kind of deal. And then my final reward is the actual sculpture popped out without a hitch. No undercuts. Epic relief. At this stage, I could start casting with this master mold, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to make a silicone mold of my master mold, and that will let me cast multiple production molds. Two things are great about doing this. One, I don't have to worry about breaking a mold because I can always cast a replacement one. And two, I can do multiple molds, which means I can cast multiple pendants at once. So that brings us back to where we started, and that is casting. Today we are going to be casting in porcelain. I'm using a Laguna porcelain slip just to make things extra exciting. It is a beautiful slip to use, but because it's porcelain, it's also tricky. Let's just dive right in. First things first, I want to agitate that slip and get it nice and liquidy. I use kind of a paint mixer for that, and then I transfer a little bit of slip into a syringe. We're going to use this later with the nubbin. And I'm also going to put a bunch of slip into kind of, this is like a condiment dispenser from a restaurant supply company. I use this because I just think it's really easy to pour slip into small molds with one of these little, I don't know, it's like a little like a mustard ketchup dispenser. I don't know. Here we go. So we're going to put the slip into the mold, a steady stream until it is completely filled. Now, once I get that slip to the top, it is critical to start your stopwatch. We're doing a 10-minute dwell. Now, keep your eye on the level of the slip in these molds. See it falling? It's incredible how quickly these plaster molds wick the moisture out of the porcelain slip. Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes before the next step, so that gives me some time to talk about what's going to happen before we dive into it, because with porcelain, with small molds, you don't have a lot of time to mess around. It's almost like the time gets compressed, both because of the size of the mold and because of the material that we're using. Porcelain just goes fast. Those giant crab claws that we're doing right now, those will dwell in the mold for about an hour and 20 minutes to build up a thickness that I like. These only 11 minutes, so it's fast. And that's why you have to keep adding more porcelain to the mix, because the water just gets wicked out of them very quickly. In fact, I should do this as I talk. So what's the next step? We're going to flip these and get the porcelain out. We only want a thin skin of porcelain on this mold, but we're going to run into some tricks. Because this is such a small mold, because there's not a lot of mass in there, it's not going to want to come out. There's not a lot of opening there for air to get in to displace the porcelain so the porcelain can get out. So we're going to make use of this. And this is a little, I guess it's just like an aquarium tube, a polyurethane tube. And I've stuck on the end a little plastic thing that I got of like a can of dust off. And I'm going to be using my lungs to force the the porcelain out of this mold. Like so. Okay, here we go. So the idea is to put this inside of the mold without scraping the sides of the mold. It's a little tricky, but I've had lots of practice since I have cast about 150 of these. But you never know. You never know how it's going to go down. Not bad. And that's why we have these little railings here. Yes, the sound does make me giggle every time I do this. Okay, but we can't stop here. You may remember that weird little nubbin for the mold that we made, and this is where the nubbin shines. We want to make sure that this porcelain pendant has no hole in it. It's not like we're making a tiki mug. We don't want this to have an opening. This is not a vessel. No one's going to be drinking out of it. I want to make a closed shape, and that's where this comes in. Working relatively quickly, I'm going to use this syringe that has a little bit of porcelain in there to inject a tiny bit of porcelain into these molds before we jam in this little cap. Now, before I do that, I have a special fancy trimming tool, which is really just a broken tongue depressor that I've sanded the edge on. And that's gonna, well, let me just do it. What I wanna do is I wanna get rid of this extra porcelain here that's on the pour spout, or what is known as the well on the mold. I have to get rid of this piece because this is where the plug is gonna go. So I just wanna carefully pry this away. Go in there, make sure it looks good. Now, if you can look inside of there, you can see that's the pendant in there. I just want to put like a little pea-sized piece of porcelain in. There we go. Time to set another timer for 20 minutes. And we keep on going. After finishing off the rest of the molds, I put the remaining porcelain back into the container, emptying out the syringe and the ketchup dispenser. All right, it's time to open up these molds and clean them out. And for that, we're going to need some special tools. I've got the seed from a blue marble tree, a rubber kidney, a soft sponge, an X-Acto knife. We've got a small trimming tool, a soft nylon brush, and lastly, a magnifier because these pendants are very tiny. In addition to gathering all these tools, I have also kind of cleaned up the work table while the plaster molds are sitting there for the 20 minutes it's going to take for the porcelain inside to kind of firm up enough for me to safely open the molds. I like to have a kind of a clean area before we begin this next detailed step. I'm also grabbing a little soft foam piece for the castings to sit on after I take them out of the molds and some kind of cling wrap to keep them from drying out. All right, we've got about a minute before I should start opening the molds. What I'm going to do is kind of, I like to call it a soft open. I'm going to take some of this canned air and just pop the molds open with that. And then I'm going to let the mold sit open before I try to take the pendants out. I want to, oh, there's my time. Let's just do it. Here we go. So, first I take out the nubbin. And I clean it up. I like to clean as I go with porcelain, just because I find that if I let this porcelain dry on these molds, it can get very difficult to take off. So I'll use this soft kidney and get any of the plaster. I keep calling it plaster. It's porcelain. It's these P words. Get that off of there. Now we open up. Again, I want to clean that off. Set that up here, and I'm going to clean off all of this stuff too. I don't like leaving any of this in here. I'm being very careful to not actually touch the casting itself. But I definitely don't want to let any of this porcelain solidify on the mold. All right, that's one down. Let's do the rest. Okay, we've got them all opened and I'm ready to move on to the next step. Now, why am I letting them sit like this after I open them? Well, porcelain is very soft and finicky stuff. It is not as robust as the stoneware slip that I normally cast my mugs out of, so I want to give it a little bit of extra drying time. Taking the back off, there's almost no undercuts on the back, so that lets it open up and it lets just air get in here and it lets it firm up just a little bit before we move on to the next step. Now, I forgot to mention one other tool that we're going to use immediately after we pop these out. Hang on. And that is this, a needle tool. We have made basically a porcelain balloon right now. There's no way for air to get in and out of the internal hollow cavity inside of this pendant. And I have found through past trial and error that if I take this out and hold it in my hand, just my body heat will make the air inside of this pendant expand and it will actually crack the porcelain. So the first thing we're going to do is pop that balloon. We're going to get this out of the plaster mold and poke a hole in it. Okay, we start with the first mold of the day. There are not a lot, actually, well, I should say there's no undercuts in this. It will really want to fall out of here, but porcelain does shrink quite a bit. So just its own kind of shrinking action might make it grab this a little. So I always want to make sure I have a hand here just in case it falls out on its own. I'll give it a little prying. And there we go. Now I'm going to quickly get a hole into this thing. There we go. We pop the balloon, now it can breathe. And I'm gonna just set it right here under some plastic and do the rest of them. Okay, there we are. We have got the castings out and under plastic. Now, I am sure you noticed that the second I started mixing that porcelain, it was pretty intense. Porcelain doesn't mess around. Once you start, you cannot stop, and you have to really pay attention to your stopwatch and your timing. At least that's what I have found in casting these pendants. Now, I have done lots of experimentation to get the timing that I'm using for these, so if you're gonna be trying this in your studio, you're gonna have to do some experiments to see what works best for the shape that you are casting. Now, the good news is these are under plastic and I can breathe a little bit. Before we move on to the next step, I think I'm gonna go inside. I'm going to get some dinner, relax, and then come back and work on the final steps. There's still a lot to do on these castings before they're ready for their firing. But the nice thing is we don't have to rush. Okay, we are back from dinner and ready for seaming. This is close-up work, and my old eyes need all the help they can get. Let's dive in. First thing first, we are going to get rid of all of the, well, since we're seaming, the seam lines to go around this. And I like to start with this center hole, the puka, if you will, in the middle of the pendant. I'll go through there with a needle tool, kind of smooth out those edges. And then I hit it with a soft nylon brush with just a little bit of water on there. From there, we move to the top. Now, this is the area you can see where we had that little nubbin, that plug that went into the top of the mold there. And it completely sealed it off, but it still has a seam line around it, so we're just going to trim that away. Okay, after I do the tops, I switch to the sides, and the sides I tackle with this small loop tool. This one's by ZM Tools. After I knock the seam down, I use kind of the rough pad of my thumb as sandpaper to smooth things out. We're going to go back and add more texture in a little bit, so don't worry about that. I just want to make sure that the seam is gone. Follow that seam all the way around. I have to be careful when holding this. You have to remember that this is a hollow clay shape, and this clay is still, it's kind of in the leather hard stage, so I could easily crush it if I'm not careful. I want to hold it like when I took fencing, they said, you know, hold it like it's a captured bird in your hand. I don't even want to hold it that firmly. I'm holding it like it's a very delicate egg, because that's what it is. All right, I've got the seam taken down all the way around the sides, but I want to add some texture. I don't have any texture here on this sculpture because I knew that was the steepest angle when I wanted to demold this, so I was afraid of adding too much texture there because it would act as a mechanical lock and make it difficult to demold. So we're going to add more texture with our magical marble. This is from the blue marble tree, and I just kind of randomly go around the sides and add just a little bit of texture. This is the same tool that I used to sculpt this, so it matches the texture that's already on the sculpture. All right, and the very last step is I take a damp, soft sponge, and I'm going to extremely lightly sponge down the back and the side seams. There we go. Now we just do that 4 more times. There we go, the final 5 castings. Now, as I said, I probably will not even use these. They're just a safety. They're just a safety in case something happens to the other castings that I've done in this edition. If those other castings turn out great, I'm gonna just destroy these. Now, these are gonna have to sit here and dry for a couple of days before we put them in a kiln and continue this porcelain adventure. After seaming, the pendants will sit on the drying rack for a couple of days. We got to make sure that all all of the moisture is out of the porcelain before we fire them in the kiln. Once they're ready, they go into the doll kiln and I fire them to cone 6. Now, this porcelain supposedly only shrinks 12%, but let me tell you, it is a very dramatic 12%. Are you ready? Poof! Look at that. Isn't that nuts? Before, after, before, after. It's crazy how small they get. Here you can see the original sculpture, and I'm going to put next to it the final fired casting, both in a white porcelain and a black porcelain. Yes, we're doing these in black. I will get to that later, but you can see the shrinkage. Now, this is supposedly just 12%, but to me, it seems like more. I mean, here, I'm going to try to line these up at the top of the frame. I mean, I guess that's 12%. I don't know. It's pretty dramatic if you ask me. All right, pendants are out of the kiln, but they are not ready to wear. The porcelain is very smooth to the touch, but it's not perfectly smooth. And these are either going to be against the new owner's skin or their delicate, fine aloha wear. And I want them to be as smooth as possible. So we're going to sand down the backs of these with some diamond sandpaper. I have got a variety of grits from, I don't know, this kind of rougher one to a 400 to a 800, and we're going to finish up with a 1500. These are made out of actual diamonds, industrial diamonds, and I have a bucket of water here because you want to lubricate with water. And then I even made this new jig. This is a new thing that I'm just trying today. In the past, I held them in my hand and sanded them, but when you're doing ceramics or anything where you have repetitive tasks, you have to be careful about repetitive injuries. And I was finding that my hands were getting tired, my joints were getting inflamed from kind of just acting as a little hand clamp while I'm sanding these. It's fine for maybe doing 5, 10, 15, but I have got 100 in the edition, and I have another 50 for the Tiki and Waikiki edition, and then I'm going to do another 100 in the black porcelain after this. So I'm going to give my hand a break. So I built this really quick, and I think it's going to be okay, but it's funny, as always, when you build something, you're like, oh, you know what? I think I have a better idea. So I might try to do a version 2 of this. I think it's worth the effort since I have so many more of these to sand. Let's see how it goes. That works pretty well. What I do is I do one of them at that, I start with the lowest grit and I go through and I work through all, I do in batches of 20 at a time, work through the lowest grit, and then I move up to the 400, and then I'm gonna move up to the 800, and then we finish off with the 1500. And today's audiobook, while I do this, will be Watership Down, which I've listened to many times and I never get tired of listening to it. I wanted to talk again about the repetitive injuries and how to avoid them. The studio is filled with repetitive tasks. I am doing big editions of mugs, so I'm casting 100, 200, sometimes 300 of the same object. So I find it's really important for me to break up all of the steps of making these pieces so that I don't do the same action again and again for an entire day. So I will break up groups of mugs into 20 or groups of pendants into 20 and just perform that action for that small group and then move on to doing something else to give my body a break. Once the pendants have been sanded, they are finished. They are ready for lashing and packaging and being shipped off to their new homes. Now, this is one of my favorite times, seeing the entire edition together. It's the only time this is going to happen, and it just really feels good to see all of the work in one place. All right, we've cast all of the white porcelain pendants that I plan on casting for both the main edition and the super special edition I'm doing for Tiki in Waikiki this year. Now, I do want to do a second edition of the porcelain pendants, but I'm going to do them in an entirely different porcelain. So I have cast a fresh set of molds, and I have some black porcelain. This is the same porcelain that I'm using to cast the porcelain pounders. If you go back a couple of episodes, you'll see me casting those black porcelain pounder mugs, and I like it a lot. It's a great porcelain, but it is different. It's a different manufacturer than the Laguna porcelain that we're using for the white pendants. So it's going to be different. My timing is going to be different. Everything is going to be different. So I am just starting with 2 molds because I suspect I'm going to have to adjust my timing a lot, and I don't want to mess up a lot of castings. This way I'll just mess up 2 castings, and once I figure it out, then I'll expand to doing 4 castings, and then we'll move up to 8 castings, and then the goal is to cast 10 a day. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna put the slip in now. This stuff, like I said, is going to go faster, I think. I have a suspicion that it's gonna go faster. So I'm setting my timer, or getting a timer ready. I'm gonna get a timer ready for 10 minutes. I think 10 minutes will be the time that this needs to dwell. But I don't know. I'm going to carefully look at this. Ooh, here we go. What I'm gonna do, well, I'm going to start my timer. What I'm going to do is I'm really going to watch the walls as they build up. So while this slip sits in the mold is going to wick the moisture out of the slip, and the slip level is going to drop in the well. And it's going to build up a skin, a wall, and you'll see lap lines, almost like when the tide comes in and out and it leaves lines on the beach. I'll see those lines, and that'll help you get an idea of how thickly the slip is building up over time on the mold walls. Fast slips will build up mold walls very quickly, and I don't want it to go too quick or it'll close up the opening to this mold and we won't be able to get the extra slip back out. That's the idea, and I can already see that level is dropping. Quick. Ooh. Let me add some more. One minute in. I did a time lapse so you could really see the way the plaster wicks that moisture away, and the level of porcelain just continually drops inside of the mold. Look at those walls building up. They're getting thicker by the minute. We are at 5 minutes. I actually think this might be ready to pull. I'm gonna let this one keep going for the full 10 minutes, which I think will be too long, but it's gonna give me a good idea, a good range to shoot for on the next casting. If this one doesn't work out. All right, that opening did look pretty big. Maybe I pulled that too early. This one's still got 3 minutes. Okay, we're just 1 minute out. Well, looks like 1 minute and 10 seconds, but this is looking really thick. You can see the walls there, how thickly they built up, and I am worried that the opening is going to be pinched closed by the clay buildup on the walls. So we're going to do this at a minute. So everyone remember, that was 9 minutes on that one. Here we go. Okay. You all know what's going to happen next because we did the same thing on the white ones. We have to clean out that pore spout and get the nubbin in there so we can have a completely enclosed pendant. But of course, cleanup is important. Speaking of cleanup, there's a very good reason I waited to cast the entire white set before moving on to the black porcelain set, and that's you don't want to mix these porcelains together. This black porcelain, it's weird. It just seems messy compared to the other clay, and it's probably because I have a white tabletop so I don't notice the white porcelain building up, but the black porcelain definitely, it gets everywhere. So you've got to make sure, I don't want to mix the two or else the castings will get messed up. Okay, here we go. We're getting into the serious business. So this is the one that we had only go for 5 minutes. So this is the relatively thin casting. Will it survive? I don't know. But all right, that piece came out. It does look rather thin. I don't know if you can see that. It is a rather thin wall, but it might be okay. Definitely for the addition, I want to go for a thicker wall, but got to get the nubbin ready. Okay, now this is the thicker one. This is the one that we went, okay, now I can already tell that this is definitely much better. This is the 9-minute casting. Okay, thicker wall on that one, I like that. We might, man, I could try to push this to 10. We'll try to do, just for science, we'll try a 10-minute casting on the next round. I'll do a 9, a 10, and 11, just to cover all the bases. But This does look better right from the get-go. I can tell this is a better wall. Now we wait 20 minutes. Again, I like to tidy up as we move between different stages of the casting, seaming, and cleaning process. I put all the unused porcelain back into the main container and get out the tools for the next step. 20 minutes later, it is the moment of truth. We are going to see how these turned out. This is the 5-minute one. Okay, all right. It's filled. As always, I want to clean as I go with this porcelain because, as I mentioned earlier, it really will stick to these molds if I don't clean it off right away. We have a casting. So I'm going to let this sit. I'm going to let it sit and just air out a little bit, firm up a little bit more before we attempt to get it out of the mold. And this is the one that was the 9-minute casting. And this is also why I keep separate castings. And see that it's already stained the mold. So I like to, if I'm going to be casting a colored porcelain, that mold is only for the colored porcelain, whereas I have a separate white porcelain mold because the molds get stained. The plaster, it's like a coffee filter. Okay, that looks great too. Oh, I forgot to clean. I didn't clean that part of the mold. Did you notice that watching at home? I hope you did. Okay. Go back and clean this out. Are you watching this at home? Where do you watch YouTube at? Are you watching in your studio? Are you watching, I mean, you're definitely not driving to work. Maybe you're commuting. Maybe you're done with work. Maybe you're in your living room. Where do you watch? I'm curious. Where do you watch Tiki Technical Tuesday? Let me know in the comments. I'm very curious. All right, this is the one that was the 5-minute casting. I'm going to attempt to get it out of here. Now, I know that this is a very thin walled casting. I'm making sure I don't have any moisture on my fingers. Let's see what happens. Oh, it's wiggling. There we go. That looks fabulous. Okay, and just like with the white, I'm going to immediately put a puka in here to let it breathe. You want to pop that balloon. All right. Wow, that went well. Let's see how well this one goes. That's also releasing really nicely. Wow, fantastic. So this plaster, sorry, there it is. This porcelain is faster. It casts faster and it seems to dry out a lot faster too. So I've got to keep that in mind when they're sitting here. I can't let them sit exposed too long. I know that they're going to dry very quickly. Well, there they are, our very first successful black porcelain pendant castings for this edition. Now, I want to say, if you were at home thinking, wow, that went really smoothly, why was he worried about it? This is actually my second attempt at doing this. Way back when I first made these molds, before I even cast the white ones, I had tried to do a black one using the same timing I was using on the porcelain, the white porcelain, and the opening completely closed up in the top. I couldn't get all the porcelain out of it after the casting. The whole thing fell out like a blob of black jelly. It was a disaster. So there was a learning curve in all of this. So I was adjusting. This wasn't just a shot in the dark like, hey, I hit my timing perfectly. No, not at all. I definitely had to do a few steps before I got to this phase of successful casting. Now, one of them is a little heavier than the other, and that is because one of them dwelled longer in the mold. We've got the 5-minute one, and the 9-minute one, and I think I'm going to end up going with the 9-minute one. Just a slightly thicker wall that'll be a stronger pendant, but I'm going to fire these and see how they fire before I make the final decision on casting times. So here we are, the end of our casting journey. Now, of course, this is not the end of the journey for these pendants. I've got to figure out how I want to lash them, how we're going to package them. I've got to photograph them. There's a lot to be done, but this episode is all about casting porcelain. So I think this is a good spot to stop. If you have any questions, please be sure to put them in the comments. I'm still figuring out this whole weird porcelain world, and I am still learning a lot. If you've got some tips or techniques, by all means, please let me know. I am eager to learn. I want to thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday.